taught 2 Bible classes this week, both that at least touched on this gospel lesson. And it was striking to me how in both of those Bible classes, everybody grabbed onto this notion of what it must have been like for those disciples to drop what they were doing immediately and follow Jesus. Imagine that. You're standing by the Sea of Galilee and Jesus walks up, says, "Drop your nets, follow me." He had no business plan. There was no printed itinerary. He offered them no contract. There was no worked out vision or mission statement. And yet suddenly, they left their old lives behind and followed Jesus. The suddenness of the call and the response probably should be no surprise for us who have read in the Gospel of Mark before. Everything happens in a hurry in the Gospel of Mark. As far as Mark is concerned, the coming of the kingdom of God is important business. There's an urgency to it. We can't wait until tomorrow, Mark says. The kingdom of God has come near, and the work must be done today. As exciting as it might be for us to look at those disciples and see how they dropped everything, left their old lives behind, and followed Jesus, the truth is we're probably not going to do that. We are not probably going to leave our jobs, or our homes, or our families, or our obligations. And so there must be other ways to follow Jesus. Which begs the question then, how will you follow Jesus? How will you RSVP to Jesus' invitation to leave the old behind and follow him? What will be different for you? As you go from this place and you encounter people out there, how will they know that you are a follower of Jesus? And just how will you follow Jesus when you can't add one more thing to your schedule? The truth is, there are things that stand in the way of our following Jesus. It's those schedules, of course, the overloaded schedules, and the constant lure of entertainment and devices and social media. There's our me-first culture, a culture that tells us we never have enough and we must get more. There's the polarizing climate that exists in our country that puts an emphasis on the fact that I'm right, and if something is wrong, that it must be somebody else's fault. And of course, at the heart of it is that age-old problem of me, that I want to call the shots in my life. Luther called that wanting to be God. What today's lessons really describe are lives that are transformed. Lives that are transformed by God's presence for the sake of doing God's work in the world. And that's what God calls us to. Transformed lives for the sake of doing God's work in the world. And in fact, that's exactly what's happening right now. God promises that through the proclamation of the word in the gathered assembly, as we eat the bread and drink the wine, that our lives are transformed. In the proclamation of the word, we hear of God's good news and God's action in our lives. And God turns us around from death to life. Jesus comes. In the eating of the bread and the drinking of the wine, we participate in Jesus' death and resurrection, and once again, we are given life. We are transformed. We are made alive. We are sent to be bread for the world. In the ordinary elements of bread and wine, they become holy things by God's action. And so our ordinary lives become holy things by God's action. A couple of weeks ago, I called a locksmith to our house. I had been needing a locksmith for a long time, but we won't go into that. Pat Bell, a local locksmith, showed up at my door the same day that I called him. He said he'd be there at 4. And a couple of minutes after 4, he was there. I showed him the back door where we needed some work done, and I went back into the living room to keep on working. And 5 minutes later, he comes back through the living room and out the door and says, "I'll go get the bill." 5 minutes? You mean I've been waiting 6 months to call you and it only took you 5 minutes? And when I got the bill, it was an extraordinary fair price that he charged. So we got to talking a little bit, and I discovered that Pat Bell is a member of St. James. And we start talking a little bit about our church and his church. And he discovered that I was a pastor. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, this is what he told me. He said, "This is my ministry. When people call a locksmith, they're in crisis and they're afraid. This is my ministry. I take care of people." That's a life transformed by God's action for the sake of doing God's work in the world. Now, I know I didn't have to go to St. James to find somebody who does that. I know that there are hundreds of people in the congregation who know that same call. But here's a guy that I met on the ground doing his work and doing it as a ministry to take care of people. Today is the day of our annual gathering for ministry, in which we reflect a little bit on what has happened in the past. You got the reports last week. I hope you've had a chance to read through them. We do a little conversation and we plan for the year to come. So as we prepare for that meeting, I want to say 3 things this morning. First, a year ago at this time, I talked with you about how congregations moving into the future are going to have to become less staff-driven and more driven by the members of the congregation. And I want to say in the last year, we have made tremendous progress on that. Now, for some of that, of course, we have been pushed into it by the loss of a couple of staff members for which we are still grieving. But we have captured that vision. There are literally hundreds of people who are giving their gifts and their talents to make this ministry work. I'm going to mention some of the ministries, and if you are a volunteer in that ministry, I'd like you to stand and just stay standing. So, if you are a volunteer in the music ministry, stand. That's all you guys. If you work in the work of faith formation, from Sunday school all the way up through adults, stand. If you are one of our workers for worship, acolyte, or altar guild, or deacon, or system minister, or usher, or ambassador, stand. If you work in our youth ministry, either youth or adult, stand. If you are someone who works to help take care of our property, stand. If you work in hospitality or fellowship or the circles, stand. If you are one of the volunteers in the office, the daily volunteers or work together to put the Gov or the bulletin together, stand. If you work in one of our service ministries, DuPage United or Bethel Christmas Store, Food Pantry or Walk-in Ministries or the Warming Center, stand. If you work in one of our care ministries, the pastoral care team or the Eucharistic ministers, then stand. You can sit down now. I'm sure I missed people. But here is a living illustration for all of you of how many people work together to make this ministry work. Over the last year, I want to recognize publicly a few people. And again, whenever I do this, there's the temptation I'm going to leave someone out. So if I've left you out, I apologize. But there are a few people that I want to recognize publicly who have taken very specific responsibilities to take charge of a ministry in lieu of our reduced staff over the last year. I want to recognize first Phil Hartwig and Larry Johnson, who have done tremendous work in organizing people to take care of our property. Phil and Larry, would you just stand so folks can see who you are? Tom Path has taken responsibility for supervising the custodial work that takes here. Tom? Jill Dew and Bonnie Ressler have taken charge of scheduling the Eucharistic ministries as we take communion to our homebound ministries. Bonnie, Jill, are you here? Janice Reamer has taken care of the scheduling and making sure that the third Sunday of the month we have someone who's doing the anointing for healing. Janice? Jim Hall has taken care of supplemental offerings, something that our parish administrator used to do. Jim? And I know Susan Hawkinson isn't here, but she's taken care of organizing all the purchasing of the things that we need for the office and for the building. Ken Foltz takes care of maintaining our computer network. Kelly Hecker has taken over directing one of the bell choirs. Kelly, thank you. Leroy Bockelman is taking over ambassadors, organizing and making sure we have ambassadors on Sunday morning. Leroy. You'll have to tell him I mentioned him. And Pam Hartwig and Bonnie Benson have taken care of our funeral luncheons. I'm not sure Floyd is here, but Floyd Johnson takes care of making sure somebody's here every Sunday to lock the doors. And Floyd also comes here multiple times during the week after hours to make sure that the building is all locked and secure. Almost every day Floyd shows up here late at night. Now, I'm sure the list could go on and on. I want to say thank you on behalf of the leadership and for me, for all of you, for the work that you're doing to keep this ministry going. I also want to acknowledge the work of the staff over the past several months. The staff has worked incredibly hard over the last 9 months, many times taking on responsibilities that they were not called to do just because somebody needed to do it. Now, that level of work is probably not sustainable into the future. We're going to have to figure out something different. But at least for now, I want to say thank you to them publicly for the way that they have picked up that mantle and taken care of things that needed to be done. Now, I want to say also that the other challenge for us now is going to be to cultivate leaders who will take our ministry out of the congregation and into the world. So far, most of those things that I have mentioned are things that we do to take care of ourselves. And while those are important, the church exists for the sake of God's mission in the world. And so the mission has to be taken out from here and into the world. I've gotten to know David Fitch a little bit over the last several months. David is a seminary professor at Northern Baptist Seminary. He writes a blog called Reclaiming the Mission. Look it up, it's great. He wrote a book called Prodigal Christianity. And in that book, David Fitch makes a distinction between attractional evangelism and incarnational evangelism. Attractional evangelism is the kind of work that we do where we put a building up on the corner, we do lots of great programs, and then we say to the world, hey, we got great stuff, come see us. It doesn't work anymore. It's the model of evangelism that was done in the 50s and 60s and 70s and worked real well for a while. It doesn't work so well anymore. He talks about an incarnational evangelism where we live the love of Christ and we take it into the community and we develop relationships so that people out there through us come to know the love of Christ. And that's the kind of work in evangelism that I'm convinced we need to move into. Taking Christ out there in showing the love of Christ through relationships of people who will probably never darken the door of the church. By the way, I'm working on getting David Fitch to come here and speak to the staff and the leadership of our congregation for an evening. I think it's going to happen probably sometime in April or May. I think it'd be wonderful if 100 or 150 of you showed up that night for that conversation with David Fitch. All right, that's one. Two is the continuing challenge to fund the mission of the congregation. We ended up 2014 in relatively good shape. We had about a $3,000 deficit, which for an $800 and some thousand budget is 0.3%. So that's pretty good. The good news is that for 2015, there's been a moderate increase in pledged income, which means a moderate increase in the budget. The budget that the council has put together that will be recommended at the gathering this afternoon is probably the most conservative budget in the past several years in terms of projecting income and matching expenses to that income. And the budget that will be proposed is a budget that has about a $9,000 surplus. There is not money in that budget for a full-time associate pastor, and if you look at the numbers, there really isn't room there for a full-time associate pastor. There is money budgeted for a half-time associate pastor. And over the next year, we'll be working to see what our staffing is going to look like into the future. In the month of December here, we raised $5,600 for Lutheran Social Services Steps for Life program. That is extraordinary. That went way beyond what I expected, what I think any of us expected. And so it is clear that the people of this congregation are generous. If there's a vision, something specific that people can give their money to. You've probably been watching the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and others how giving to congregations is declining generally. The per capita giving is lower than it has been since the 1920s. Now, here in this congregation for 2015, we bucked that trend with a moderate increase. But the truth is that it is much easier for us to cast the vision for a special project than it is to cast the vision for people to fund the operational budget of a congregation, and that remains a challenge. Number 3. The last year has been full of changes for us, and not the least of those changes has been 2 difficult goodbyes. People grieve differently at different schedules, and I know that some are still grieving those losses. Those losses have been challenging for us as a ministry, but by God's grace and through the power of the Spirit, we have really answered that challenge in so many different ways. Now, exactly what things are going to look like into the next couple of years is an unknown. But I hope that doesn't surprise you. God's call is always a call into the unknown. Just think about the disciples in today's gospel. I happen to be one of those people who is comfortable living in the midst of the ambiguity. I know not everybody's like that. The Congregation Council has chartered a task force that over the next 12 months will prayerfully meet to discern, to have conversation, to study, to read, to pray about the future vision and calling of our congregation. And I hope that 12 months from now, at the time of our next annual gathering, that we'll be able to report to you based on the work of that task force with a little bit more clarity what our staffing and what our vision for ministry is going to look like. But at least for this year, it is a step into the unknown. But the truth is, we always walk by faith. Remember the story when God called Abraham? God called Abraham and his wife Sarah, who was barren, to leave their home and their family and go to a place they had never been with the promise that Abraham and Sarah would be the parents of a great nation. And so God called them to step into a future that had no shape but was full of promise. And when God called those fishermen of our gospel lesson, he called them into a future in which there was no detail, but only that Jesus would make them fish for people. And they left their nets and followed him. And they walked into a future that was full of promise. And so here we are, people of Faith Lutheran Church, at a time of great challenge for congregations, but also a time of great opportunity. You know, I look around and I see all the people of this congregation. I see all the assets that we have. And I am so excited and so enthused about the ministry that God has called us to do, the way that God has called us to be. But I am most excited and most enthused, not because of who we are or what we have. I am most excited and most enthused because I know who God is. And I know that God has called us to walk into a future that is full of promise.